Well, good morning, folks. It is an absolute pleasure to be here, and I know it says that Sarah's doing opening words today, but she asked me to do them, so it's a pleasure to do that with you. So it's holiday time, right? And it's time for lots of memories, at least for me. And I remember, with this month of Innocence, I remember one holiday in particular. I must have been about 13 years old, because I remember my brother Pete being really little. And it wasn't a really great year for my family. My dad had been unemployed for a really long time, and my mom was sick and physically compromised. So Dad actually had applied for food stamps. Now, we weren't going hungry, the food stamps, and then the government gave away surplus food. They gave us great vats of peanut butter. And you had this, and chunks of yellow cheese, which is amazing what you could do with yellow cheese and peanut butter. We belonged to a big Catholic congregation at the time, and one day our friends from the congregation showed up at our house with a big box. Now I remember this box because it was decorated all the way around in red foil paper, and it was filled with food and candy, and there were wrapped packages. We got the Christmas basket that year. And I remember them walking in and setting it on the table. My brother and I, we just tore into that box. We were pulling things open. I found those raspberry candies, you know, the hard ones with the centers that get all chewy when you suck on them. And I thought it was glorious. And then I looked over at my mom, and she was seated over sort of on the side, and I saw the look on her face. Her face just dropped. And I thought for a moment she was going to cry. And I thought, wow, she can't have this. This is way too hard. And I think if she could have gotten up and picked up the basket and pushed it out the door with our friends, it would have helped her. And in that moment, I think I lost just a little bit of my innocence because I thought it was a glorious gift. And yet I realized even then that it requires a generous heart to give, but it also requires a generous heart to receive. And my mom had a real hard time with that. So I thought that's why we come to church, right? Because here we get to explore during these times of holidays what it means to have a generous heart in the giving and in the receiving of gifts. So in the holy days ahead and the holidays, I wish us all a generous gift of a generous heart. Thank you. Well, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, especially today. And I have to confess that I love this time of year. I love the glitz and the bustle. I love the lights and the family and the gifts and the cookies. My house is decorated like a true Christmas wonderland. Just ask Joe. And I know that not everyone shares my enthusiasm, and I do understand. I've certainly had my share of challenging seasons. There was a year of a really bad breakup when I was young, the year my mother died, and the year my dear husband was so very sick. And yet somehow, the promising story of peace on earth and the rebirth of innocence wins me over every year. There's something about celebrating the birth of innocence in the darkness of winter and a brand new year that follows, that offers an enticing sense of possibility and renewal. Now, perhaps part of this enthusiasm that I have is because I was raised Catholic, and Christmas is indeed a really big deal when you're Catholic. Now, for the first few years of my school education, I attended public schools. I approached Christmas as a time where we, yes, went to midnight mass, but it was more of a family holiday and less of a religious one. The true meaning of Christmas at that time was cookies and family. And then, when I was about 11, my mother decided in 6th grade that I, for some reason, needed to attend Catholic school. She enrolled me into the parochial school down the street, St. Ambrose in Rochester, to be specific. I don't know quite what I did to warrant this change, but it truly influenced my life for at least 5 years and maybe even longer. See, my first Christmas at St. Ambrose Grammar School offered a different perspective on the holiday, one that required something of me that was challenging and even more challenging than anything I had done before. You see, I still remember when Sister Mary Catherine turned to the class and asked, "Are you pure enough to receive the Christ child?" Well, that was a loaded question. I had no idea if I was pure enough to receive the Christ child. I knew that I wasn't the easiest kid to handle. My mom sort of told me that every day. And Christmas time, there was always the threat of coal in my stocking, which quite serious for me at times, although I never actually got any, at least not yet. And I really did try to be good, but frankly, being good for Santa was one thing. Being good and pure for the Christ child, well, that brought the whole business up several notches. However, in true Catholic fashion, there were ways to take care of my impurity. They were prescribed and easily available to me. I could simply go to confession and be forgiven and innocent once again. Now, if we explore a bit of Christian history, we find that the original Christian church that's before the Protestant Reformation believed that the common person, you and I, well, we needed a roadmap for our spiritual journey. We needed an intermediary in the role of a priest, and we needed marked activities and essential elements of life to guide us toward God. Consequently, the Roman Catholic Church had sacraments. They marked the beginning of life, marriage, the end of life, to name a few. And then there was confession. The sacrament offered Catholics forgiveness for their transgressions. It allowed them in some way to reclaim their innocence on a regular basis. And when I was a kid, that was every Friday night or every Saturday afternoon before Mass on Sunday. Now, I don't want to get into a long discourse on Christian theology here because I'm pretty sure we would all fall asleep. So I promised to be brief. But I do believe that there are some current lessons in this history that are relevant to our lives as Unitarian Universalists. So please stay with me for a couple more paragraphs. Now, the practice of confession became complicated and corrupted during the Middle Ages. You see, in medieval times, rich individuals could buy indulgences, a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card. It could relieve them of their punishment for sins they had already committed. In fact, if you think about it, there could be some easy comparisons and parallels to modern-day life. These indulgences allowed them to sin without consequence and to get into heaven faster, which was really what it was all about, I think. The practice of selling these indulgences so corrupted the Catholic Church that it is often cited as one of the primary reasons for the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, with the protest of Martin Luther, the concept of by grace alone came into existence. See, no longer were pious individuals required to engage in a myriad of complicated practices or good works to gain closeness to God. According to Luther, they were saved by grace alone, grace that was given freely by God to all humankind. Okay, here ends history lesson. Now, we Unitarian Universalists have our foundation in the Protestant Reformation, and although our religion has evolved to include reason and rational freedom of thought, there are some remnants in our perception of grace and in our rejection of ritual that might just warrant another look. Now here I am specifically thinking of the practice of confession and the experience of forgiveness. So, in addition to being a minister, I'm a trained spiritual counselor and director. And since there are relatively few UU spiritual directors in the country, I am often contacted by individuals from across the continent, US and Canada. They are looking for a companion for their spiritual journey. Now, many years ago now, a man from Canada who wanted a spiritual director contacted me. We met by telephone for several months, every 2 weeks or so. Now, it didn't take long in our conversations for me to realize that this dear, dear man was tormented by a collection of decisions he had made in his life and actions that he had taken. He told me this. He entered a marriage quite young and perhaps innocent, or at least naive, of the influence of his homosexual feelings on his life. He tried to ignore them, but couldn't. He had been unfaithful over the years to his marriage, and finally, he had left his marriage, in which he had 2 children and a devoted wife, for a man he was infatuated with. He described his actions as creating great strife for his wife and his children. His relationship with the other man hadn't lasted, and he believed he had made a mess of his own life and the lives of so many people. It was the focus of most of our conversations for many months. And as a spiritual counselor, I did what I thought was necessary at the time. I endorsed and supported his need and right to know and honor his own sexuality. I acknowledged his suffering, and I listened to his experiences. But after a while, I realized that our conversations were going around in circles and were merely giving him some continuation of his torment. He was beating himself up over and over again for his actions, and all my permission and support of his search for truth and meaning wasn't helping him get beyond his anguish. So one day, in the middle of our phone conversation, I asked this born and raised Unitarian if he wanted to confess his sins. I'm not quite sure where that thought came to me, but it seemed like the absolute right thing to do. In the silence on the other end of the phone was powerful. I heard him choking back his tears. I wished desperately that we were together in person, but the bond between us at that moment was holy. And then he simply said, yes. And between great sobs and painful words and even a bit of laughter, my companion unburdened his soul and asked for forgiveness, not from me, and I'm sure not from God either. He asked for forgiveness from himself. He asked forgiveness for falling short of his own expectations of himself as a partner, as a father, and as a human being. And on that day, he did not regain his innocence, but he did become gentler with himself. He regained some of his lost dignity, and by releasing the burden of self-punishment, he began to imagine a path forward in his life. Over the course of the next several sessions, he chose ways to make amends. He wrote letters of apology to his former wife and his now adult children. He opened communications, and he began to walk slowly back toward his family, toward reconciliation, and he found a new way to be in relationship. I think it was a profound experience for him, but it was a profound experience for me as well. Confession and forgiveness are not common words or concepts for Unitarian Universalists. They may even cause us to bristle, or we may discount them as obsolete or unnecessary. We UUs have never been taught that we are sinful or that we need God's forgiveness. We accept our humanness and our imperfections, and that is a good thing. But when we really mess up, is the grace of life alone really supposed to be enough to bring us back into right relations? Maybe not. And perhaps confession and forgiveness is worth another consideration. Dr. Juliana Brienz is a postdoctoral fellow in social psychology at Brandeis University. In a recent article, she wrote this: "The ability to forgive oneself for mistakes large and small is critical to psychological well-being. Difficulties with self-forgiveness are linked to suicide, eating disorder, drug abuse, and other relationship problems. But self-forgiveness has a dark side," she tells us. "Research suggests that while it can relieve unpleasant feelings of guilt and shame, it can also reduce our empathy for others and our motivation to make amends." In other words, while self-forgiveness is important, it may at times serve as a crutch, producing a comforting sense of moral righteousness rather than motivating a sense of moral responsibility. Well, when I read this, I thought, well, then that means there must be a right way or a healthy way to forgive oneself. And Dr. Brienne goes on to say that there is. Here's what she recommends. First, do not get rid of guilt. That was hard for me. I grew up in an Italian Catholic family. My husband's Jewish. We're supposed to get rid of our guilt, right? But no, not according to Dr. Brienz. First, don't get rid of your guilt. Feeling bad when we do something wrong is natural, and it may even be useful. It might be where we find the motivation to do better the next time. But not all bad feelings are equal, she says. Shame involves negative feelings about oneself, a sense of worthlessness. That can be destructive, but guilt, by contrast, involves bad feelings about our behavior and its consequences, and this opens the possibility for positive change. Second, she tells us, own up, recognize what you have done wrong, pay attention to what there is to forgive. Don't allow these mistakes to define our perception of who we are. Balance them with the good that we know in our life, but fess up, own up when we've done something wrong. And then, we need to pay our dues. Just as we probably wouldn't forgive anyone who did us wrong unless they made it up in some way, forgiving ourselves is most beneficial when we feel like we deserve it. Rather than simply going through the motions of atonement, it's useful to consider what kinds of reparation will actually make a difference for others and for our own spiritual growth. Because while Dr. Brienz believes this is for our psychological well-being, I believe it also affects our spiritual well-being. And then the last piece is to remember the other with empathy. Self-forgiveness need not be all or nothing. It can be a slow process, and maybe it never ends. Maybe it never should end. But it results in a release of negative feelings, and we might just get to see through the act of humility an honest acknowledgement of our capacity to harm others, as well as our potential to do good. Well, these are great recommendations and ways that we can effectively make up for the mistakes in our life. However, without a regular or routine practice of forgiveness, these steps are difficult. I mean, it's not like every Tuesday night I think, okay, what do I have to do here to forgive myself or the people in my life? It's not part of what I do anymore. I believe without this kind of practice, it leaves us prone to hold grudges against others more often and to beat ourselves up for the mistakes that we make. We may end up carrying the burden of remorse with no obvious outlet. Now, the Catholic practice of confession, or as it is now called, reconciliation, it may hold little value for us. But the one thing that it does for Catholics is that it normalizes forgiveness. Forgiveness becomes commonplace, reachable for everyday mistakes. And with atonement and true examination of oneself, reconciliation is attainable for serious life transgressions. The Buddha taught that we should do away with negative actions, practice virtuous actions, and tame our mind through meditation. See, on a daily basis, Buddhists strive to become more aware of their thoughts and actions, and to see the thoughts and actions shape their experience and their world. They strive to stop performing negative actions and to purify negative actions that have already been done. While at the same time, they strengthen and expand the positive actions that they are already performing. A true Buddhist would do this with daily meditation. Now, the Jewish tradition also offers us insight. They require repentance, confession, and restitution for transgression. They devote the holy day of Yom Kippur as a point on the calendar where this work is done to become pure for the new year ahead. Well, that's a lot of good, solid information from the world's traditions. But what does our tradition say about confession and reconciliation? Now, if you look in your hymnal right now, you'll find prayers of confession in the back. I was surprised too. Number 476 says this: "Before the wonders of life, we acknowledge our failures to see and revere. Before the sanctities of life, we are ashamed of our disrespects and indignities. Before the gifts of life, we own that we have made choices of lesser goods, and here today we seek gifts of the Spirit. Before the heroisms of life, we would be enlarged to new devotions." There are a few others in there, well worth looking at, well worth spending some time. Eric Walker Wickstrom is a UU minister, one of my favorite authors, and he wrote the book Simply Pray. In this book, if you haven't read it, he helps us reclaim the spiritual practice of prayer, and through it, an approach to confession and forgiveness that I think works well in our tradition. You see, Eric helps readers explore the relevance and gifts offered by prayer practice, and he honors what's described as the essential elements: naming, knowing, listening, and loving. In fact, if you get his book and spend time with it, you can even make a prayer bead bracelet kind of thing, and it allows you to concentrate on going through the process of these steps. I'll take you through them just briefly. In the naming, he says, we identify and acknowledge that which is holy to us and express gratitude for our life. Now, Eric says we shouldn't get too caught up in who we name in this part of the prayer, because then we get stuck. If we don't recognize a God in the world, we can name whatever we recognize as holy. But to not get stuck there allows us to move on to the other aspects of his prayer practice. And then we move on to the knowing. This is perhaps the perfect place in this UU-inspired practice for confession and reconciliation. See, this is a place where we ask the necessary questions. Who needs to forgive us? What have we done that was less than our best? When were we selfish or inconsiderate? When were we short or impatient? When were we cruel and hurtful to another? Who has been harmed by our actions and words? We cannot change or resolve our mistakes if we put them behind us or hide them from our own soul. This prayer of naming allows us to bring fresh air to our actions and to see them honestly. You see, and then if we continue to follow Wickstrom's advice, we listen. In the quiet solitude of our own heart, we begin to know what is needed, what will help repair our mistakes, what actions we must take to make up for what we have done. I believe that life offers grace, I do, and answers in the presence of our own yearning. If we clear our mind of static, I believe we can hear them, but it takes practice. And last, in Eric's recommendations, we offer love. And in this place, we offer love to ourselves and to the other. Love that does not allow us to reclaim our innocence, but allows us to reconcile our less than perfect selves. Engaging in this practice every day, or several times a week, or even once a week, normalizes forgiveness. You see, I think it helps us elevate our behavior to that which the Buddha advised: practice virtuous acts. And by intimately knowing and admitting and forgiving our own failings, we become more open and forgiving to others. We are better equipped to overlook the shortcomings of others. See, we give ourselves and others a break. Nelson Mandela died last week. He offered so much to humankind during his life: the value of revolution, of a strong voice in the face of injustice, humility, and fidelity. I believe we can count him as one among our holy teachers, along with Jesus and Buddha. And perhaps his greatest gift was showing the world what is possible through forgiveness and reconciliation. In a world full of hatred, a simple man who had every reason to choose revenge or violence chose forgiveness. He changed himself, his people, his country, and the world. He is a beacon for all of us. We can only imagine the prayers he said in the quiet solitude of his own mind in his jail cell for 27 years. We can, however, follow his example. We can believe what is possible by the gift of forgiveness and reconciliation. We can choose to make them a part of our own life. So as we approach this season and look for purity in our heart, may your holidays be filled with possibility. May you find peace with your own shortcomings. May you reach out to others in forgiveness, and may the vision of the holy teachers direct your heart. Amen.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.